Leila Jenkins, an unassuming human with a calm demeanor and ordinary appearance, was assigned to be the bodyguard for Varnak, an esteemed diplomat of the Ultrix Empire. It was the kind of assignment most military personnel on Earth could only dream of, an opportunity to protect one of the galaxy's most influential leaders. Yet to Leila, it was just another day. She had seen her share of dangerous assignments, though none quite as prestigious as this one. The Ultrix Empire, rulers of countless star systems and technological marvels, had never known a species as harmless as humans. While their fleet of ships could vaporize entire planets, humans were regarded as little more than a nuisance to the galactic powers. To the Ultrix, the thought of a human bodyguard was laughable. Leila, with her modest height, unremarkable brown hair, and plain attire, couldn't have been further from the towering armored soldiers of the Ultrix. Varnak, an imposing figure even among his own kind, seemed entirely unconcerned by his human protector. His eyes gleamed with the cold, calculating brilliance of someone who had long since learned how to manipulate the galaxy's political landscape. Leila's role seemed like a mere formality, something to check off on a list, no more significant than an extra chair at a banquet. The negotiations were set to take place on Tauren, a neutral world renowned for its luxury and wealth. It was the perfect setting for the peace talks, and Leila was stationed just outside the glittering grand hall where Varnak would meet with representatives from the rival Sharun collective. The Ultrix and the Sharun had been at odds for decades, and both sides knew that this peace treaty was critical for the future of the galaxy. Earth, with its far-flung colonies, was trying to carve out a place in this cutthroat galactic order, and Leila was one of the few humans to have ever stepped foot in a political arena of such magnitude. Despite the grandeur of the setting, Leila felt like she was in over her head. She had only a small earpiece, a few concealed weapons, and a level head. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't even here to protect Varnak in any meaningful way. Her assignment was simple: blend in and be a subtle, unnoticeable force in the background. The aliens would never suspect that the seemingly harmless human standing near the doors might be the deadliest presence in the room. But Leila had learned a long time ago that appearances could be deceiving. As Leila Jenkins stood in the grand corridor of the Tauren Diplomatic Center, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Around her, the shimmering marble floors reflected the distant hum of alien conversations, while the walls glistened with vibrant lights from distant stars visible through the panoramic windows. It was a breathtaking sight, but Leila was far too focused to appreciate it. Her eyes scanned every figure, every movement in the crowd, as she kept an ear open for the faintest sound that might signal danger. Varnak, walking with his usual grace and self-assurance, seemed completely at ease. His long, flowing robes fluttered slightly as he moved, his pale blue skin almost luminescent under the artificial lighting. The Ultrix diplomat was the picture of political poise, exuding an air of superiority that matched his empire's dominance. Beside him, Leila was nothing more than a shadow. She walked with the same quiet professionalism that had become second nature, her gaze constantly moving to anticipate any threat. The delegates from the Sharun collective hadn't arrived yet, but everyone knew their presence was imminent. The Sharun, with their aggressive expansion and militaristic tendencies, were the most dangerous rivals the Ultrix had ever faced. Every diplomatic meeting with them was a high-stakes game, and this one was no different. The fate of entire star systems hung in the balance. But even though the negotiations were fraught with tension, Leila couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air felt too still, too tense. "Stay close," Varnak's voice interrupted her thoughts. "The Sharun are unpredictable. Their presence here is a sign of their desperation. We must show strength." Leila nodded, her gaze sweeping across the hallway. She had no idea what kind of tricks the Sharun had up their sleeves, but one thing was clear: they didn't plan to let the negotiations go smoothly. She could feel the faintest stirrings in the air, a sense of growing hostility, and she knew the peaceful facade would soon shatter. She hadn't been wrong. As the Charon delegation entered the hall, the atmosphere changed instantly. The two leaders, Varnak and Zorith, the cold, reptilian head of the Charon, locked eyes, and the tension between them was palpable. The other delegates took their seats, but the silence lingered thick and uncomfortable. For a brief moment, Leela felt the stirrings of unease in her gut. She knew a political standoff when she saw one. But what came next was far from anything she'd prepared for. Without warning, a sudden explosion tore through the room. The force of the blast sent shockwaves through the chamber, shattering the tranquility in a heartbeat. Security alarms blared, and people screamed. The Charon had made their move. The peace talks were over. The war had begun. The explosion reverberated through the hall, throwing Leela off balance. The ground beneath her feet buckled as smoke and debris filled the air. People screamed, scrambling for cover as panic erupted in every direction. But Leela's training took over. Her eyes immediately scanned the room, calculating escape routes and identifying the most immediate threats. Her first priority was Varnak. The Ultrix diplomat, who had remained still in shock for a split second, was now surrounded by his guards, who were rushing to form a perimeter. But the Charon assault had already breached their defenses. More soldiers poured through the broken walls and shattered doorways, heavily armored, and wielding energy weapons with ruthless efficiency. It was clear that the peace talks were nothing more than a ruse to lure the Ultrix into a trap. Leela didn't waste a moment. She reached Varnak just as a plasma blast whizzed past them, searing through the air. Without flinching, Leela grabbed his arm, pulling him down the nearest corridor. The Ultrix bodyguards, frozen momentarily by the shock of the attack, quickly regrouped and formed a defensive line behind them. "Stay close," Leela ordered, her voice sharp. Varnak's usual calm demeanor faltered for only a second as he nodded, still processing the rapid shift in the situation. Leela moved with purpose, her eyes never leaving the advancing Charon soldiers. She knew the Ultrix forces were good, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. In that moment, she was their only advantage. As they rounded a corner, a blast of energy hit the wall just inches from them, and Leela instinctively threw herself and Varnak to the ground. The explosion sent a ripple through the corridor, but Leela was already back on her feet, pulling Varnak toward a side door. The two of them darted into a small utility room, and Leela quickly assessed the situation. The door would hold for only a few minutes, but she needed a plan. "Get to the control room," Varnak gasped. "We need to lock down the building." Leela met his eyes, her expression hardening. She had seen enough. "Not yet," she said. "We need to take out their command center first. If we don't, they'll just keep sending reinforcements." Varnak hesitated, and for the first time since the blast, Leela saw the weight of the situation sink in. He trusted her. But it wasn't just her skills that mattered. It was her ability to think beyond the immediate danger. She reached into her suit and pulled out a small, hidden device. It was an EMP grenade, capable of disabling all the Charon's tech within a large radius. She would use it to cripple their systems, buying them the time they needed to strike back. "Stay down," she muttered, as she made her way back toward the door. Leela's pulse quickened as she crept back toward the door. The sounds of Charon soldiers moving outside the utility room grew louder, but she stayed focused. She had to time this perfectly. The EMP grenade in her hand hummed softly, its blue core pulsing with a low vibration. It would be their best shot at crippling the Charon's ability to continue the assault, but the moment she threw it, the element of surprise would be gone. "Varnak, stay low and stay quiet," she whispered, her voice a sharp command. Varnak nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. He didn't speak, but his steady gaze on her showed he had complete trust in her plan. Leela appreciated that more than he knew. With one last deep breath, she pulled the door open just enough to slip through. Her eyes darted left and right, calculating the distance to the enemy forces. There were only a few Charon soldiers stationed near the central hallway, their backs turned as they barked orders at one another. Perfect. She moved swiftly, almost soundlessly, keeping low to the ground. The EMP grenade in her hand felt heavier than it was, its potential to shift the tide of this battle weighing on her shoulders. She moved toward the far wall, just behind the last two Sharun soldiers, who had not noticed her yet. The hallway was bathed in dim, flickering lights, casting long shadows that made her every movement blend into the darkness. Leela's heart thudded in her chest as she tossed the EMP grenade across the hall. It landed silently, just behind the soldiers. There was a brief, eerie pause before the grenade's energy field activated. The air shimmered with an electric hum, then the world seemed to freeze. All the lights went out, and every Sharun weapon powered down, their communication systems failing in an instant. A few moments passed in complete silence. The Sharun soldiers froze, confused, their weapons useless in their hands. Lila didn't waste the opportunity. She sprinted toward them, her body a blur of movement. In a matter of seconds, she reached the nearest soldier, kicking his weapon out of his grasp and sending him crashing to the floor with a well-placed strike to the chest. The other soldier, still disoriented, didn't even have time to react. Leela incapacitated him with a swift elbow to the throat, his body crumpling to the ground as his breath was stolen from him. With the immediate threat neutralized, Layla sprinted back to the utility room. "EMP's done," she said, breathless. "We have a few minutes, but it won't last. Let's move." Varnak, now more composed, nodded and followed her out. The hallway was quiet now, but the tension in the air was palpable. The Sharun were disoriented, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. They needed to reach the command center before the Sharun regained control of their systems. As Leela led Varnak through the hallways, she could hear the distant sounds of reinforcements. Sharun soldiers regaining power, reactivating their weapons. Their time was running out. "Keep moving," Leela urged, knowing they had to stay one step ahead. Lila led Varnak through the narrow, dimly lit hallways of the Tauran Diplomatic Center. The EMP grenade had bought them precious time, but they both knew it wouldn't last long. They could already hear the low hum of power returning to the Sharun systems, and the sounds of soldiers regaining their footing echoed from the other side of the building. They needed to get to the command center, but the Sharun wouldn't make it easy. As they rounded a corner, Leela motioned for Varnak to stop. Ahead, a group of Sharun soldiers moved cautiously down the hallway, weapons drawn. They were still on edge, trying to regain control, but it was clear they were beginning to coordinate once more. Leela crouched, pulling Varnak down beside her behind a stack of metal crates. She peeked around the edge, calculating their next move. She could hear the soldiers talking among themselves, their language a guttural, hissing tone that sent chills down her spine. "They're coming closer," Varnak whispered, his voice low. "We need to move now, before they see us." Leela nodded, her mind racing. There were 4 Sharun soldiers in the corridor, and she could take them out, but it would have to be quick. Every second counted. She had trained for moments like this, but the stakes had never been higher. Her hand subtly moved toward her side, where a small, sharp blade was hidden in her suit. She could use it to silently incapacitate the soldiers one by one, but she would have to act fast. Varnak was watching her closely, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. He had seen her in action before, but never in a life-or-death situation like this. "Are you sure you can?" "Trust me," Leela interrupted softly, her gaze never leaving the approaching soldiers. She stood and moved swiftly, positioning herself in the shadows just behind the nearest soldier. With practiced precision, she leaped forward, grabbing the soldier's throat and using his momentum to slam him into the wall. The soldier crumpled, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The remaining 3 Sharun soldiers spun around, their eyes locking onto her in surprise. The element of surprise was gone, but Lila didn't hesitate. She was already moving, her body a blur as she disarmed one soldier, knocking him out with a brutal strike to the head. The 2 remaining soldiers raised their weapons, but Lila was already on them. She dropped low, sweeping one soldier off his feet with a powerful leg sweep. As he fell, she twisted his arm behind his back, dislocating it with a quick snap. The last soldier tried to fire, but Lila was faster. She sidestepped the shot, closed the gap, and knocked him out cold with a well-placed punch to the temple. The hallway fell silent once again. Lila took a breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Clear," she said quietly, offering Varnak a reassuring nod. Varnak looked at the unconscious bodies of the Ksharan soldiers and shook his head in disbelief. I don't know how you do it. How do you make it look so easy?" Lila didn't answer. There was no time for words. The command center was dimly lit, its sterile, metallic walls reflecting the eerie glow of blinking consoles and flickering holographic screens. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burnt wiring. Despite the chaos outside, it felt oddly calm in here. For a brief moment, Lila allowed herself a deep breath before turning to Varnak, who was still trying to process everything that had happened. "We need to disable their central command system," she said, her voice low and urgent. "If we don't, the Ksharan will retake this entire facility within minutes." Varnak nodded, visibly shaken but steadying himself. He moved to a console in the center of the room, accessing the primary system with practiced ease. The Ultrics had their own encrypted networks, but this was Ksharan tech, brutal and efficient. Still, Varnak's fingers flew across the holographic interface, hacking through layers of security protocols. "I'm in," Varnak muttered, his voice tense. "I can take down their communications network and scramble their reinforcements. But there's a backup system. If I don't shut that down too, we'll only slow them down for a few minutes." Lila watched the door, her eyes flicking between Varnak and the hallway outside. She knew the Ksharan wouldn't give up easily, and their reinforcements were no doubt already en route. But right now, she had one job: keep the pressure on and protect Varnak while he worked. Suddenly, the blaring sound of alarms broke the silence, and a red warning light bathed the room in crimson. The backup system was online. "They're here," Lila said, her voice tight with urgency. "Varnak, we need to move fast. Can you disable the backup?" "I'm working on it," he replied, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But I'll need a minute. Hold them off." Lila didn't hesitate. She grabbed her weapons, a pair of pulse pistols tucked inside her suit. She moved to the door, listening for footsteps, the steady thrum of soldiers approaching. She could feel her muscles tense, every nerve ready for the next wave. As the first Ksharan soldier appeared in the corridor, Lila wasted no time. She stepped into the hall and fired, the pulse energy from her pistols cutting through the air. The soldier crumpled to the ground, but she didn't stop to check his vitals. Another soldier rounded the corner, followed by two more. Lila's movements were fluid and precise, her shots expertly landing in their chests, disabling them instantly. But more kept coming. She could hear their boots pounding the floor, the sound growing louder by the second. They were relentless, but so was she. With every soldier she took down, more took their place. But Lila was never overwhelmed. She was a force of nature, each action calculated, each shot landing with deadly accuracy. Inside the command center, Varnak's voice broke through the chaos. "Got it. The backup's offline. We've bought ourselves some time." Lila didn't waste a second. She ran back into the room, her heart pounding, as the last of the Ksharan soldiers fell at the door. The alarms had stopped, and the room was momentarily quiet. "We've got a few minutes before they realize we've cut off their reinforcements," she said, her eyes locking with Varnak's. "Now, let's finish this." The silence in the command center was almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the damaged consoles around them. Lila could feel the pressure building, the weight of the entire mission on her shoulders. They had secured the room, but the fight wasn't over yet. The Ksharan would regroup, adapt, and strike back with even more force. They had to move fast, or their victory would be short-lived. Varnak was already at the central terminal, his fingers flying over the controls as he worked to lock down the Ksharan's access to their main weapon systems. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his alien features were tight with concentration. Lila could see how much this meant to him, how much he had staked on their success. But she also knew he was out of his element. The Ksharan were his people's greatest threat, and the weight of that threat pressed heavily on him. "We've got 5 minutes before they breach the main gates," Leela said, her voice low but firm. "I'll handle the perimeter. You finish what you're doing." Varnak barely looked up from the screen, his voice strained. "I'm close. I just need a few more." "I know," Leela cut him off gently. "I'll be quick." She turned to the door, her pulse pistols still in her hands. The moment she stepped out, the sound of boots echoing in the hallway reached her ears. The Ksharan were coming. Fast. She wasn't sure how many, but there was no time to count. Leela's instincts kicked in as she moved swiftly to the nearest corner. She peeked around the edge, her gaze scanning the hallway. 4 Ksharan soldiers, heavily armored, marched in unison, their weapons raised and ready. It was the perfect setup for an ambush. Leela didn't hesitate. She activated a small explosive device attached to her belt and tossed it down the hallway. The device hummed for a moment before detonating with a soft but deadly whine. The explosion was precise, knocking 2 of the Ksharan soldiers off their feet and scattering the others in confusion. She moved before they could recover. Lila darted forward, her feet silent on the floor, and in the blink of an eye, she disarmed the closest soldier, sending him crashing to the ground with a sharp elbow to his neck. The second soldier turned, but Lila was already on him, using his own momentum to twist his arm and force him into a submission hold. She slammed him down hard, knocking the wind out of him. Behind her, more Ksharan soldiers rushed forward, but Lila was already back on her feet, moving with lethal efficiency. She didn't give them time to react, her pistols raising in tandem. One shot to the chest. Another. The soldiers fell, their bodies crumpling as she systematically cleared the hallway. By the time the last of the reinforcements arrived, Leela had already moved past them, back into the command center. The door slammed shut behind her, and she exhaled, wiping the sweat from her brow. Varnak looked up, his expression both relieved and impressed. "It's done. The weapon systems are offline. We've won." For a brief moment, the weight of their victory settled over them. They had done it, but even in the midst of their success, Leela knew that the Ksharan would never accept defeat so easily. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The command center was quiet, save for the faint hum of cooling systems and the occasional beep of a console that had yet to be shut down. Lila stood over the terminal, her eyes scanning the encrypted data that Varnak had finally unlocked. The weight of their success was starting to settle in, but she knew better than to relax too soon. The Ksharan were relentless, and though the facility was momentarily under their control, the true battle was only just beginning. Varnak looked exhausted, but there was a fire in his eyes. "We've secured their communications network," he said, his voice steady but tinged with tension. "But the Ksharan will regroup soon. We've bought them time, but not much." Leela nodded, her fingers brushing against the sleek surface of the terminal. "They won't give up," she murmured. "But neither will we." The door to the command center suddenly rattled, followed by the unmistakable sound of Ksharan soldiers pounding against the reinforced metal. They were regrouping faster than she'd anticipated, and it wouldn't be long before they breached the entrance. Lila turned to Varnak, her expression hardening. "Can you override the main gates? Lock them down again." Varnak's fingers danced over the console, his eyes flicking between the various screens. "It's risky," he said. "If I lock them now, the Ksharan will know we're here. It'll take them less than 5 minutes to send an assault team." Leela didn't hesitate. "Then we'll be ready for them. We can't let them get any closer." Varnak nodded, already working, his hands moving with purpose. Lila turned back to the door and took up a defensive position near the wall. She was out of ammo in one pistol, but her backup weapons were still fully charged. The Sharun would likely be carrying heavy artillery, but she'd trained for this. She could hold them off. The door rattled again, this time with a force that almost shook the entire room. Lila could hear the shouts of Sharun soldiers on the other side, their guttural language filling the hallway. The countdown had begun, and she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The terminal beeped sharply. "Done," Varnak said, his voice tense. "The gates are locked, but they'll be able to break through in 10 minutes if we don't take them out first." Leela took one last look at Varnak, meeting his eyes. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." She moved swiftly, positioning herself at the door with a grenade in her hand. She wasn't sure how many were out there, but she had one chance to turn the tide. As the door began to give way, she threw the grenade, watching it roll just out of sight before detonating with a satisfying blast. The explosion sent shockwaves through the hallway, followed by screams of confusion and pain. The Sharun soldiers faltered, temporarily disoriented by the blast. Lila didn't wait for them to recover. She rushed into the hallway, her pistols raised, and opened fire. The Sharun were in disarray. They'd expected a fight, but not this. Layla moved through them like a whirlwind, her every shot precise and deadly. Varnak was right behind her, his own weapon now active, providing support. Together, they cleared the hallway, pushing the Sharun forces back. When the last soldier fell, the hallway was silent again. For now, they had won. But Leela knew this was just the beginning. The war was far from over, and this victory would only make the Sharun more dangerous. Still, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of relief. They had held their ground, and that for now was enough.